So my half-sister, when she was very young, had an epiphany, seemingly out of nowhere. She said, "Oh, I get it. Toothpick. Like you pick your teeth. Toothpick. Get it?" Which we laughed about for years to come because, to be honest, we all kind of got that already. Sometimes language is easy, or at least seems easy and sensible to native speakers, but it's not always so easy as toothpick. One thing to understand is that the word understand has nothing to do with standing or being under anything. A far-fetched idea isn't one that you fetched from far away, but it's one that's unlikely. A dipstick is a stick that you dip in motor oil, and very specifically motor oil, but not if you're using the word dipstick to mean idiot. To foretell is to tell about something beforehand, but there's nuance there. If foretelling is specifically a prediction of eerily psychic qualities, just saying I'm going to the store tomorrow wouldn't really count. And in English, people park on driveways and drive on parkways. So breaking a compound word in English into its two parts can sometimes tell you a lot about the word, or it can tell you not a lot about it, or nothing at all, or the opposite from what it really should. So with that in mind, what is a man bed? And why does Corinthians say they will not inherit the kingdom of God? Let me come back to that. First, I want to talk about alcohol. I bring that up because Corinthians, in one clear word, says that drunkards will not inherit the kingdom of God. Do not be deceived. Neither the immoral, nor idolaters, nor adulterers, nor soft man beds, nor thieves, nor the greedy, nor drunkards, nor revilers, nor robbers will inherit the kingdom of God. I think nuance is important when it comes to translation, especially translations of the Bible. There are Christians who have never had and never will have a drink, not a drop of alcohol, because they think it's wrong, and the Bible seems clear in condemning drunkenness. But let's not forget that at the Virgin Mary's request, Jesus himself turned water into wine. Specifically, wine that was to be served at a wedding party that had already drunk enough to exhaust the host's supply. And at the Last Supper, Jesus himself poured wine for his closest disciples to drink. So if a blanket condemnation of all drinking is a bad way to translate drunkards in 1 Corinthians, what is a good way to translate soft man beds? And why does Corinthians say they're not inheriting the kingdom of God? Also, what does 1 Timothy mean when it says, "The law is laid down not for the innocent, but for the lawless and disobedient, for the godless and sinners, for the unholy and profane, for those who kill their father or mother, murderers, fornicators, arsenokotai, slave traders, perjurers, and whatever else is contrary to sound teaching." I'm going to level with you in advance and say, I don't know exactly. But it's a phrase being used to condemn all homosexuality as sinful, and as such, I think it's worth discussing exactly what I or anyone does and doesn't know about what man beds does and doesn't imply. What Paul wrote to the Corinthians and what's written to Timothy, of course, actually doesn't say man beds at all. That's English, and both books were written in Greek. What they say is arsenokotai, coming from the arsen, meaning man, and koi. I probably say it wrong, to be honest. Koitai, meaning beds. Realistically, we don't know exactly what it means. It's an especially hard word to translate for two reasons. One is that, unlike most of Greek, 1 Corinthians is the first place in all of written history that word appears. No joke, it's the first place. There's literally no other previous context to interpret that word off of. Secondly, as for later writings, there's only a handful of other places in written history where that same word appears, and to my knowledge, it's always in a list of vices. Lists don't give you a lot of context. For example, if you saw a list that said orange, pineapple, banana, you'd be right to guess that pineapple was a kind of fruit, but you wouldn't know at all what kind of fruit it was, and you'd be wrong if you thought it came from pine trees or resembled an apple. So looking at other written context, koitai does give more clues. In addition to meaning bed or bedroom in the literal sense, it is also used to mean lying with, i.e. having sex with, and usually refer to the penetrating partner in a relationship. So arsenokoitai can mean man penetrator, which is getting somewhere. But it's hard to say if it's a man who penetrates or a person who penetrates men. In a different light, some authors have noticed that since koitais is plural, it means many beds, and that better translation is the man with many bed partners. Koitai is in fact used elsewhere in the Bible to denote promiscuity, for example in Romans 13. So it seems pretty clear that sex is the topic of this word, but exactly how is unclear. Now, in Corinthians, malakos is the word right before arsenokoitai, and it is a common word that literally means soft. You could use it to say that a pillow is soft, but it could also have the connotation of effeminate. To run with the stereotype, effeminate man penetrators could feasibly be a reference to homosexuals of some kind. But malakos was also used at that time to mean morally soft, with connotations of loose, wanton, unrestrained, or undisciplined, an implication that fits the context at least as well as effeminate. So the phrase could translate just as well as wanton men with many bed partners. The words themselves are so unclear that since Greek had no commas, malakos arsenokoitai is sometimes translated as one vice and sometimes as two separate vices. In the American Standard Version, it's two, the effeminate and abusers of themselves with mankind. In the Revised Standard Version, it's just one, sexual perverts. In the New International Version, it's one, men who have sex with men. By the New Revised Standard Version, it's two again, male prostitutes and sodomites. Now, if you think that that's kind of variable, but all roughly in the same ballpark, remember that those are all English versions of the Bible from the 20th century, which is a fair amount of variation to get in one language in a small amount of time. But there's more. Actually, until the Reformation of the 16th century, malakoi was thought to mean masturbators. It has also been translated as weaklings, so it's not always been about homosexuality at all. To contrast with some clarity, all four of the Bible versions that I talked about identically translate the words idolaters as idolaters, adulterers as adulterers, thieves as thieves, drunkards as drunkards, and the only variation in the greedy is that in the ASV it's written as the covetous. So there's a lot of words where we know exactly what's going on and we translate those words consistently, but malakos arsenokoitai is not one of them. One possible translation is that the pair malakoi arsenokoitai refer to young male prostitutes and the men who bought them. Malakoi is translated as male prostitution in several versions, for example, the NRSV, the 1973 version of the NIV, though not the newer one, and one of the older King James versions translates it as catamites, which are specifically young boys who are kept for sexual purposes. What's the backing for those translations? Well, we're talking about Rome, where such things definitely happened, and Corinth was known to be a particularly lascivious city. Also, a big chunk of the rest of Corinthians 6 rails against prostitution and fornication, so it makes contextual sense. Looking at the list themselves, which often group similar sins together, arsenokoitai seems to bridge sexual sins and economic ones. For example, in Timothy it bridges fornicators and slave traders, which is an interesting triplet where the whole rest of the list is in really, really obvious pairs. Now, I don't know that malakos arsenokoitai means that. In fact, anyone who thinks that young men unwillingly sold into sexual slavery or boys who get molested are at all at fault or guilty for what happens to them is absolutely wrong. But I think it's likely that some sort of exploitive sex is implied. I don't know what kind of sex is exactly being referred to, but the thing of it is, nobody alive is conclusively clear on what it means. My point is that taking it as a condemnation of all homosexuality is a monumental and really poorly supported assumption. On the other hand, some sort of exploitative sex, while also a guess, would at least make a lot of sense in the context of the verse, the chapter, and the New Testament's general message about the law.